Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malika Young pot dotting inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. So, as you guys may or may not be aware of, I literally just found out earlier today they are having the Sinquefield Cup. I mean, I should have known because they did mention it before, but I forgot. But they have the Sinquefield Cup going on right now. So, they just got done with Wesley versus Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. And it was a pretty roller coaster up and down game. And unfortunately, it was the last one to get over. So I had to wait literally till like right now to be able to do the video. But for all my people in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking makaibigan. Hello, Ulit. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Anybody who is coming from Azerbaijan, I will say salam to you and chak sagol. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. If you guys are ready to go, let's go ahead and take a look and see what we have for this game. So we got e4, e5, knight comes to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, bishop to c5, castles by white, knight comes to f6, and we do have d3. So we have the Giuoco piano. It's not going to be a Giuoco pianissimo, but you know, it's, as I tell you guys all the time, these are rarely ever quiet games. There's usually, you know, like a lot of fireworks everywhere. So we got castles by black, all pretty standard stuff. You know, we got h3, d6, trying to get the bishop out. We got c3, making sure that we give this bishop a little bit of room to back up at some point, maybe. Knight comes back to e7. We got rook to e1. Knight comes to g6. We got d4. So kind of like, you know, like a center attack situation going on. We got bishop coming back to d6. We got bishop down to d3. And then we do have d5, which is the novelty of the game. And this actually gives white a nice little advantage. We do see pawn takes d5, which was the best move in the position. Pawn takes d4, and then we have c4, a nice little in-betweener move. You know, you could have possibly went, you know, pawn takes here, but you know, it's nice to protect this pawn that's you know, pretty far advanced. So we do see c4. We got c6, and you know, we got queen to c2, pawn takes d5, and then we actually have c5. This pawn is actually very weak, and there wasn't really a good way to kind of defend it. You know, you could have definitely tried to go like c5, but after b4, you know, as you can see, white is pretty heavily disrupting your pawn chain. So, you know, and this also gives white a completely passed pawn. So you definitely don't want to do that. So like I said, we did see pawn takes d4, c5. Bishop comes back to c7. We see knight takes d4. Rook comes to e8. We got rook takes e8, queen takes e8, and then we have knight to c3. And it was actually at this point in the game, I think that Mamedyarov, he took like 25 minutes or something for this move. I wasn't watching the broadcast at that point, but that's what I think that's what they were talking about. So that's crazy. Queen to e1 was definitely the best move in the position. We see bishop coming back to f1. Now, of course, as you guys can see, you know, this bishop is holding the only Luft square for the king. So bishop has to come back to f1. It's the only move. So we see bishop to d7, trying to make sure that we can get this rook out into the game. Queen comes to e2, and this does force a trade. I mean, this, as you guys can see, this queen doesn't have anywhere to go. So we see queen takes e2, and out of the 3 different ways that you can actually capture back, knight d taking e2 is the best. I mean, personally, I think I would have went bishop takes. I mean, it's still you're still end up being all right, but the severe advantage came after knight d takes e2. But I mean, personally, I probably would have just went ahead and just did bishop. I mean, it kind of seems like this knight just kind of jumps in the way of the bishop, prevents its development. So, or like further, you know, getting back into the game. So knight d takes e2. We see rook over to c8. You know, trying to see if we can get this pawn at some point. So we do have bishop coming to e3. Knight comes to e7, and then we have rook to d1. It's the most logical, you know, point for the rook to go to. You know, also it is protecting the pawn on d5. Not trying to drop any pawns. We got a6. We see g4. And, you know, normally g4 is like a pretty big weakening move, especially when you're throwing pawns in front of your king. But, you know, the queens are off the board. So, am I blurry? Maybe I'm not blurry. Seems like I'm blurry. Maybe I don't think I'm good. I changed the lighting in my room. You guys might notice that I watched my stuff for a long time. So, you know, I'm trying to like see what's the best lighting to use. So it just looks a little different to me. Anyway, you know, g4 is definitely much safer with there being no queens. As you guys are familiar, whenever the queens leave the board, a lot of tactical opportunities do go away. So, I mean, you know, it's a little bit safer to throw these types of moves out. So we got bishop. Actually, you know what? I don't think I mentioned this actually. D5 was the novelty of the game. I'm not sure if I mentioned. I'm just making sure that I do. Like I said, after we see G4, we do see bishop coming to C6. We see F3. You know, this is creating like a nice little like kind of like, you know, fortress type of thing in front of the king. So we do have H6, B4. Rook comes to E8, and we see king coming to F2. You know, that's a pretty nice way of defending this bishop. You know, getting the king a little bit closer to the center of the board. We see bishop back to D7. We got bishop to F4, encouraging a trade. Bishop takes F4, knight takes F4. We got D4. Because as you guys can see, the heat on this D5 square was just too much to handle. You know, it was, you know, after this bishop possibly comes, let's say like the B3 or something like that, you know, you do have the ability to attack this pawn another time. You know, bishop coming here, you know, you might see something like A4 pushing B5, knocking the bishop back. So, you know, we didn't want to see any of that. So we did see D4, but, you know, this is definitely White's game. White is in the driver's seat. Rook takes D4. We got knight to C6, rook to D6. Knight takes B4. We got rook over to B6. We see A5, rook takes B7. So now you see that White has snapped the pawn off the board. We got bishop to C6, a little counterattack, but rook comes to A7, and now we're threatening a second pawn right here. So we got G5 knocking the knight, knight down to D3. You know, White definitely wants to trade pieces. Like I say, you know, when you are up any material, you do want to trade pieces. And right now, you know, you have an extra pawn, you do actually have a pass pawn on the C file. So rook comes to D8. We see knight up to E5. We got rook to D2 a check. King comes to G3. So, you know, got a little like, you know, little nook here created for the king. We got rook over to C2. We see A3. We got knight B takes D, or knight B to D5, sorry. Knight takes D5, and then we have knight takes D5. And we have actually reached a point in the game that if you do want to pause the video and see what the absolute strongest move in the position is, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So I think for a lot of you guys, like, you're looking at like the obvious knight takes C6, but you probably are kind of thinking like, man, there has to be something wrong with that because it can't just be a free bishop. It actually, it's not a completely free bishop, but you do have the ability to take it. So if you guessed knight takes C6, that would be the complete correct move. This isn't what we saw in the game. Wesley did something a little bit safer, but it was still nice. Like I said, after knight takes D5, knight taking C6. The problem with knight taking C6 that you have to consider is that the knight is going to come to E3, and you have kind of a problem because if you're not careful, you're getting mated on G2. So if you saw knight take C6 and you went with that, congratulations. But if you went one step further and calculated that you actually have to go bishop to E2, then, I mean, you just super gangster. Like, I mean, you're going to be a world champion probably at some point. Because you have to calculate giving up the bishop because that is the only way this knight is going to be attacked. You know, you are actually looking at knight takes F1 with mate. So you have to do something. And moving the bishop any further than bishop to E2 just allows this mate to come up on this square. So you have to be really, really careful. So bishop would come to E2. After rook takes E2, you would actually be looking at F4. And this is actually really nice. And you do have this pass pawn over here. But the king does have some room to work. So that's definitely some deep calculation that would have had to have occurred. And Wesley stayed away from it because he's like, man, I don't want to get mated. So what he actually did in the game, which was still a nice move, is actually went bishop to D3. And this just allows a nice little tempo on the rook. It does allow the pawn on C5 to be taken, but you know, after rook takes C5, this is another critical point. And what we saw Wesley actually do is he actually takes on F7 with the knight. And this was actually, there was like 3 main moves that you can do. Rook taking F7, knight taking C6 in this position were actually much better. You know, knight took F7. We saw knight down to F4, just like a really perfect outpost square for the knight. Bishop came up to F5, and then we saw bishop to D5, and this is asking a real question to this knight. But if we back up, after knight took C5, you did actually have the ability to go knight takes C6, rook taking C6, and then rook taking A5. And I mean, you're not completely winning, but you are up a pawn, and you do have a completely passed pawn. So, I mean, those were definitely, you know, multiple different things that Wesley So had. That they were down on time, like, very heavily. So that was one of the issues in the positions that we were seeing. As Wesley So had a definite advantage in time, but then he just kind of started losing that advantage. And they were literally both down to like 15, 20 seconds by this point in the game. So that's kind of where the little like slight errors and stuff like that are coming in. So like I said, we did see bishop to d5. The knight came down to e5. We see rook to c3. Rook takes a5. So now we're up 2 entire pawns. But the unfortunate thing is black actually has a way to just completely come back in the game. We see rook to e3 first, which is that is very crucial because we do have to knock this knight away. The knight comes to d3. Rook takes f3 with check. King goes to h2. Rook comes to h3 with check. And now you see that black has gotten both of their pawns back. And there isn't a way for white to really escape the position that they're in. King comes down to g1. We see rook to g3 with check. King comes to f2. Rook to f3 with check. King comes to g1. Rook comes to g3 with check. King comes to f2. Rook back to f3 with check. King to g1. Rook back to g3 with check. And king comes to f2. And unfortunately for Wesley So, because he was so completely winning this game, they have drawn by threefold repetition. So that is a very, very interesting outcome. Like I showed you, I mean, even going back here, you know, after we saw rook takes c5, I didn't look at this one very deep, but there was a rook takes f7 in the position. You know, that just wins you a pawn as well. It just gives you a little bit more play. You know, the bishop is probably going to have to move. You know, you have the ability to put this bishop here or here, even checking and stuff like that here. So you definitely had some options and stuff like that. So that was a pretty interesting, but also pretty disappointing game. Like, we've all been there. Like, we've all been in a position where we're just completely winning and just allow the game to slip away. So it's always disappointing when you don't win a game that you probably should have won. But for all my people in the Philippines, I'll do these good mornings real quick. So maanyong buntag, mayad na agahan, nainbeg na bigat, masanto siya kabuson, marhe na aga, buenas dias, maanyong aga, mapia na uma, kapian kapuno dios, mayap a abak, mayad na aga, mapia agay, mapia kapa pizza, my big abukla, marjan na buntag, maria mainat, maupe na aga, kasanyangan CLB, salam, assalamu alaikum, and merci to you guys. Makito tayo mamaya to my people in the Philippines, pa'alam, and I will see you guys next time.